the united and the separate. At first sight, these two concepts seem to be two opposite qualities of pairs of things or sets of things. Indeed, either two objects are united, they share the same medium, the same characteristic, or they are separate, they seem to live different life without never interacting with each other, they are separate. But these concepts don't seem to share symmetry. Indeed, whenever two objects are said to be separate, they are said to be separate according to an observer that can put them in a unified syntax in which he recognizes both of them, and then he identifies a relative separateness, but absolutely they're actually unified in the syntax of the observer. And so unity seems to be more fundamental than separateness, because separateness always emerge relatively to a more fundamental unity. And there's no symmetry in that, because you can go down into the layers of unity, go down in the layers of reality where you do what we call the unisection of the syntax of everything that seems to be distinct. And by unisection, you arrive at a place where no unisection is possible anymore, because you arrive at the place where both syntax and information, both theory and universe, emerge irreducibly, and they cannot be reduced to more fundamental things because you break any meaning behind that. So when you do the unisection, so you look for the unity of things, you arrive at a medium that by itself is united with itself. So you arrive at a medium that have the infinite potential of everything, of all the possible separateness that you can observe, but by itself it represents absolute unity. And this unity is not separate, because it is the unisection of every possible separate thing, and it converges because we see that there is a sense in which there's unity in reality. So there's a layer that converges to the absolute unity of that, and this layer points to a fundamental unity. So unity is more fundamental than separateness. And there's a sense where there's absolute unity, and it calls to what the Neoplatonist would have called the one. In a sense, it is an aspect of God as the Father, of the emergence, the fundamental layer in which every specific thing emerge. So unity is more fundamental than separation. And this makes this concept a bit more subtle to understand. Also, as soon as this unity, the one, emanates into anything specific, because a unity by itself, you could be infinite potential, you could be just a block of unity, but by itself it would be an unused potential. So it would lack the perfection of being something specific. So unity is almost equivalent to void in one sense. And so unity separates, emanates into something specific. And as soon as it becomes specific, unity becomes coupled with separateness. Because whenever you quit absolute unity, then you have something like relative unity. So absolute unity, the father of absolute unity, we tie it in mathematics with the number 0, because there is 0 plus 0 is 0, 0 times 0 is 0. So sort of an aspect of the father. And so something which you can see 0 is just with itself, but it's sort of, it is everything, but it's also the void. So it's also nothing. At rest with itself, but without any separation. And whenever you start to have separation, you have concepts such as, and you want to have an identity. What is this unity? What is this fundamental principle of unity? Then you start to have concepts such as true and false, real, not real. So this absolute unity, which is an ontic, ground state, or the one, becomes separated in reality and unreality, truth and falsehood, I guess. And so you have this polarization and the separation. And so unless you're speaking about the absolute ground, the absolute unity of the divine, then you only have relative unity, conditional unity. It is conditional because it separates the true unity, truth, reality, from unreality, from untruth. Morally, it separates the good and the bad instead of total either infinite potential or nothingness. It separates in between good and bad. And so that's what we have when we have in the numbers from 0, then you have also the +1. And +1 is tied to an algebraic structure of the plus and minus with possibility to conditionally go to plus, right? Minus times minus is plus, plus times plus is plus, plus times minus is minus. So there's an algebra where things can be conditionally plus, conditionally truth, conditionally reality. Because as soon as you exit unity, then you start to have separation. And so as soon as you don't, so unity is more fundamental, and as soon as you quit the fundamental unity, then not only separateness is relative to the unifying medium, but also unity becomes conditional because it is grounded on the separateness of the separation of what is united to truth, what is united to real, what is united to good, and the rest. So there's only conditional unity as soon as you're not talking about the one, but the Father, but about reality. So this +1 with Christianity, we could polarize the world with Christ, I'm truth. So you have this separation of reality, which becomes union with the ultimate identity of the one, but it becomes a conditional union. It's not an absolute union. So with good, you have bad as well. With pleasure, you have pain as well. So that's sort of distinction that emerge. As soon as you quit this infinite potential, which is also seen as nothingness if there was no emanation. So that's the concept for the concept of unity and the separate. And there's also an interesting aspect of the science of unity. Because the science of unity cannot be just an accumulation of facts, because facts emerge as separate instances within the union. So the science of unity is a science that explains the structure of unity. It's not evident within the medium itself what this unifying structure is, because you're already at the level of the content within the unity when you perceive the medium. And so the science of unity becomes something like the rational endeavors of Immanuel Kant, to explain the unity of consciousness, all the efforts of Christopher Langen to explain the unity of reality, with CTMU, so the universal distributed form. So the science of unity becomes the structure, this knowledge of the one, and then the nous or the logos that emerge, that emanates from the one, and the structure that it takes, and the structure that it takes with then the soul, or the instances of the incarnated one, which you can understand in the CTMU as the syntactors, which we are an instance of, where we see not the concept of separation, but we actually see reality, and we see truth around us, which are instances of this separation of truth, falsehood, but which is embedded at the deeper layer in reality, where we're not at the identity of the one, but we're at the identity of the individual within the one. So deeper layers of explanation of how the unity comes together in practice, up to the level at which we observe reality. This knowledge of unity takes a specific structure, which Christopher Langen calls logical induction, to outline the structure of unity, of reality. This is interesting because when you think about other kinds of unity, the unity of consciousness, the unity of consciousness can only derive from a science of unity which is more fundamental unity. And so in the CTMU, there is this knowledge of the structure of unity, and then consciousness derives from that. And it cannot derive from specific separate instances of functionality of that unity. So you look at the structure of the neurons, the structure of the brain, the structure of individual perceptions, of the sequences of perception. All of this can only be separateness within a unity. So in the CTMU, there is this concept of syndiphonesis. We have the synetic aspect, which is a similar aspect, the shared syntax, and then you have the diphonetic aspect, which is the different instances. And so if you look at all the different instances of perception for a particular individual, you have the diphonetic aspect of his identity, but then you have the synetic aspect, which is the unity of consciousness. And you cannot explain the unity of consciousness with this separate instance, but you have to understand them within a language of the science of the united, which becomes the science of how the language appears to itself. And so this knowledge of the united takes form of not of collection of facts, but unifying principles that are everywhere distributed within the structure of reality. These principles take the form in the CTMU, for example, of the triality. You have the theory, the universe, the model. Meaning you have a coupling between the theory and the universe, the ontology and the epistemology. And there's a modeling of reality within, according to the theory, into a specific, into the universe that embeds the system of this triality. In the Christian theology, you also have the theory of God, the Trinity, with the three persons, which are different aspects, principles that unite reality within this Trinity, this trial aspect of the ultimate. And so the science of the unity, of how to approach the unity of consciousness, for example, takes the form of a language that derives from this higher level Trinity, either the triality of the CTMU for the logical aspect in which you could interpret the Trinity, the Christian Trinity, for example. And for the Christian, the unity of consciousness is explained as a soul in the system of the Trinity of God, right? And so you have this system that explains the overall Trinity of reality, that reshape reality, and then the unity is explained according to this concept, which are either logical with logical induction or revealed. Any relative or conditional reality that emerge within reality then derives from the specific aspect, the specific component that makes a boundary of that unity, but it derived from these high-level unities. And for example, when we think about real numbers, which can be characterized by the set of real numbers, by the fact that the properties of this set can be derived from axioms of real numbers of a complete ordered field. We think of the fact that the numbers represent themselves in the Cartesian space with a real number line, or the Euclidean space, but with coordinate like developed by Descartes. We have all different emanation of a specific unity, which is the unity of the numbers, of the real numbers. And if we need to think about the real numbers in the same way, I don't think we should think about them in separateness. There's one aspect where they can be represented in space by using the coordinate of Descartes. There's a certain way where they can derive from axioms, and so you can separate even these axioms into different statements about numbers. They are a group, additive group. They are a field. They are a complete field. All of these diphonic aspect of the real numbers derive from a unique concept, different aspect of what? Of the real numbers. And so there's also a principle of unity that must be identified for the real numbers that says this is a principle that unites all these different aspects. And if we look at the cinetic aspect of the real numbers, one of the things that we're exploring is how to make this cinetic aspect, the uniting aspect of the real numbers, how do we derive them from the uniting aspect of reality in general, of this universal distributed form that distributes itself within all of reality and that explain all of the united identities that emerge within reality. And so that's why when we have the trinity 0, 1, and plus infinity, these are unifying principles that explain both the geometric aspect of numbers, the logical aspect by associating all of the different propositions of the axioms to specific primary numbers as a 0, 1, and plus infinity, and giving them each of these primary numbers, 0, 1, plus infinity, specific affinities with those propositions, and shaping all of the properties of real numbers from unique principles that relies both on a combination of three primary numbers, but also a use of principles such as homology, which is a distribution of the syntax of the primary numbers within the numbers, which is also a property that is used to explain the overall unity of reality. And so from this science of unity, which is explained in terms of homology, of triality, of logico-geometric language, we can derive principles and ways to describe numbers that make them emerge from a seed of unity, to give the identity of real numbers, using the language, this broader language of the science of unity. And this language is not obvious if you look at one aspect of the numbers. If you want to look at them logically and you use the axioms and you even change maybe the axiom a little bit to have the same result, the same set, you look at them in a set theoretic way, if you look at them geometrically, you never exhibit the unity that is behind them. And maybe you won't care because you say, I'm just looking at them this way. But this 0, 1 plus infinity, which you never conceive whenever you look at a specific aspect of this unity, is the underlying definition that makes a unisection between many aspects of the numbers, both the spatial aspect and the logical aspect. And so you never see these three numbers, especially this plus infinity as we define it, which defines the completeness of numbers, the fact that the Cauchy sequences converge. You never see this plus infinity because it is part of a unifying syntax that develop the unity of the real numbers within all these different aspects of the real numbers. It could be easy to dismiss or to miss the fact that you need a unity to explain all that, but it's part of the science of the unity to find all the principles that you need to coherently derive all the properties of the numbers, both geometric and logic properties, from a unique set of principles, and to leverage the language of unity overall to derive these principles. And so that's the work of the 0, 1 plus infinity, of the mathematical trinity. It is using this language of trinity to explain numbers as specific identities that develop tied together by a single seed, which happen to have these three poles, the 0, 1, and plus infinity, but that derive into different diffeonic aspect language that then you can use and be an expert in, either in logic aspect, in the geometric aspect. 3 things to remember for this video. First of all, the united and the separate are not symmetric. Unity is more fundamental because by unisection you arrive at the overall medium, infinite potential, which also lacks identity, which is sort of a block without identity. As soon as you have an identity and you give an identity to this infinite potential, you get the identity of the one, and then that's where you have truth and non-truth, real and unreal. And so you have separateness, which is relative to a broader unity, and you have unity, which is a conditional unity because it is unity only in terms of the separateness of truth and non-truth. And so you have sort of an orientation of the truth. And so these structures of unity, when you embed them in reality, there is sort of a science of unity, which you cannot see from the instances that bind separation and unity. It is a structure that is on top of this unity, which Kant had developed for the sort of tentatively for the human cognition that Christopher Langan has described in the CTMU, where this unity distributed in the world that admits separate instances is the unity of the triality, where there's a structure with a theory, the model of the universe, that sort of make this distributed form with a structure where there's the one and then there's the distributed form that distributes on every aspect of reality, including the secondary terrors, which we accounted by sort of human. You have this unity that derives there. It's not obvious when you look at the object, but it's just the structure of the unity overall that supports the possibility of the unity within the separateness of real, not real, truth, not truth. That gives medium to every aspect of reality. So that's the second thing to note. And so the third thing to note is that when we develop the model of the mathematical trinity, we also develop something which is sort of a uniting seed behind the different aspects of the real numbers. We give an identity to real numbers, and we derive them from components which are fundamental in the theory of unity of identities, meaning we use the imagery of the component of the father and then the distinction with plus and minus, So 0 at rest, and then a fundamental distinction, and algebra on the distinction, which creates a break between nothingness and then truth and not truth on both sides. And then we also use different concepts such as the geometric and logic aspect of reality. And so you have these three components, 0, 1, and +infinity, which are both seeds of the logical propositions of the axiom of real numbers, but also of the geometric embedding of these numbers, with 1 is the unit with the length, and +infinity is of the suprema at infinity that embeds the properties of completeness. And so this 0, 1, +infinity is as well a science of unity. So specific identity using the language of the broader unity. And it is likewise, it's not something that you see in each of the instance when you use that unified identity. You don't see every part of what we develop to make the structure of the unity. But the structure of the unity explains all the rest. And so it is because the structure explains the different aspects of the real numbers within a coherent identity and explain all of the aspects that you can call it the unity of real numbers, the more fundamental. So there's a knowledge as well of the unity of the real numbers, just as there is a knowledge of the unity of the conscious, which makes it so that you don't have just a series of perception of neuronal activations, but you derive the unity of consciousness as a soul derived from the system of the unity of reality overall. And all of these derive from the overall unity of reality, which also give this structure, these rational structures in which we can interpret all the relative separateness and all the relative unity conditional to the orientation toward the truth and the identity of this more fundamental unity, which has no separation. But as soon as it becomes real, then there's an unreal, then there's the inverse of this identity. And so there is the possibility to not be in the conditional unity. I hope this is useful. I think it would be very easy to just think, oh, there's just this overall unity, and then there's just sparks of distinction just for my own pleasure and my own benefit. But when you think about unity, unity is more fundamental, but it is a very specific thing with infinite potential. The absolute trinity, the Father. And as soon as you get out of that, you have relative unity. And so you have the science of unity, of how truth is shaped, how reality is shaped, developed by the CTMU. And again, the unity of numbers, you have to have unity, an identity of numbers. And so we need to look for more fundamental identities that emerge in fundamental aspect of numbers. And so we can look for the different principles that are not outlined potentially now, but that explain everything that is outlined now through a broader unity that make the coherence of the real numbers together.